All right, good morning, economics students. This is your first lecture for Monday, April 27th. We've finished prices, and we've got two more basic topics that we're going to be looking at for the rest of the course. The first one is looking at monopolies, cartels, and then what to do about them, which is called antitrust legislation. So that's one broad topic that we're going to do. Then we're going to talk about minimum wage laws and another example of kind of the government controlling prices, but in this instance, it would be prices for labor. And then the final topic we're going to be looking at is money and banking. So we talked a lot about money from when we were looking at theory, but Sol will help us understand kind of some of the more practical aspects of how money is regulated by the government, how its price is established, and then how the banking system actually facilitates or not the use of money in the economy. So those are the kind of three major final topics that we'll be looking at. We'll end the course reading a little bit of Chesterton, just a couple of short pieces, and then we'll be done. So we're getting near the finish line. Hang in there, and hopefully we can move forward pretty quickly. Um, so this lecture is looking at monopolies and cartels. So this is a portion of chapter 7 in Soul. So this starts on page 145 and goes to 153. And so he's going to define what monopolies and cartels are. Then he's going to talk about how prices are different in monopolies as compared to competitive economic markets. We'll talk about kind of what's the impact of monopolies, why are they detrimental to the economy, and then also the difficulty of actually maintaining monopolies and cartels over time, and how sometimes cartels and monopolies are uh, uh, attacked by government policy, but also sometimes private companies also kind of come to the rescue to try to stop monopoly. So that's what we'll be dealing with for this first lecture. Hopefully, it won't take too long. The second lecture might be a little bit longer because we're looking at what to do about monopolies, particularly antitrust legislation and other forms of government regulation. That'll be the second part of the lecture, the second lecture for Monday for our double period. So again, if you're following along, you just need to read those 8 pages in Soul and be able to answer some questions about them. I'm going to try to keep it short and sweet and pretty straightforward. On page 146, he actually defines what a monopoly is, and that's just basically a market with one seller. Okay, so it's one firm that is setting the price without any competition from anybody else. Now, an oligopoly, or some people call it a cartel, is a small number of sellers that collude together to set the price. And usually, what happens is you're setting the price above what the natural equilibrium price would be between supply and demand. And that would, of course, assume that there's several competitors that are entering the market free from any constraints, whether it's and sometimes there are certain naturally occurring monopolies. There's just some places, only certain places where you can find diamonds, for example, in large quantities. Cranberries are only able to be grown in certain parts of the world. And aluminum for a long time was a natural monopoly because there's only certain places in the country that you could actually find aluminum. So sometimes they're naturally occurring. More often than not, monopolies are actually the result of government collusion and basically government preferring one firm over another. And so what happens with either a monopoly or a cartel is that there is a capture of the market of a particular good, and that this price that ends up getting set is higher than normal. So It talks about at the bottom of 146 certain examples of in America monopolies. AT&T, American Telephone and Telegraph. They were regional monopolies where really there was just one service provider. Says that for about a half a century before World War II, the Aluminum Company of America, Alcoa, produced all the virgin ignat aluminum in the United States. Monopolies, by their very nature, are rare. But they're also harmful to the economy, so you don't want them to continue. And I think in a lot of instances, there are people who believe that monopolies are more common than they actually really are. And so one of the big questions then becomes, how are monopolies detrimental to the economy itself? And that's really the question that we're going to want to really look at here. So again, the idea is that monopoly is one seller. There's an oligopoly or cartel, which is a small number of sellers colluding together. The result is the capture of the market of a good that set prices higher than normal. Those are some examples: AT&T, Alcoa. By the way, not all big businesses are monopolies, and not all monopolies are big. Sometimes, if you're a small company, but you're in a sparsely populated area, sometimes small companies can actually function as monopolies. And again, the big question is, how are monopolies detrimental to the economy? Okay. The next section he looks at is monopoly prices versus competitive prices. So he says one of the good ways of kind of understanding what kind of harm a monopoly causes is to look at how a competitive pricing system works versus a monopoly pricing system. So he uses the example of of apple juice. Okay, and so most people don't know what goes into making apples. They just know that they like to drink it. Um, and so let's say it's starting out, there's only a few companies that are making apple juice, and that the prices are high and the profits are high. In a natural price system with multiple competitors, he writes, if the price of apple juice is higher than necessary to compensate for the costs incurred in producing it, in other words, there's a price that's set that you're actually recouping a lot more than what you actually put into it. Those higher rates of profit will be made and will attract ever more investment into this industry until the competition of additional producers drives the prices down. So that high profit is going to get around. That it's going to be hard to keep that a secret, and so other companies are going to get into that market and typically drive the price down. Now that's in a competitive market system, but for a monopoly, it says chances are that the monopoly prices remain at levels higher than necessary to compensate for the costs and efforts that go into producing apple juice, including paying a rate of return on capital sufficient to attract the capital required. The monopolist would earn a rate of return higher than necessary to attract the capital, but with no competing company to produce more output, the monopolist would continue to make profits above and beyond what is necessary to attract investment. So what happens is that in a monopoly situation, you don't that word doesn't get out, and part of it might be because you're in a particular market or particular type of product that just doesn't naturally have a lot of competition. And when that occurs, what ends up happening is a misallocation of resources. Okay, and that's really what ends up happening, is that monopolies affect the allocation of scarce resources with alternative uses. And so what happens is that, let's say the use of apples for apple juice is a really kind of valuable use of that product. And it's high in vitamin C. It's good for children. It has lower sugar than maybe orange juice, so there's less tooth decay. So there's a value in that. And so if you're not going to if that price is artificially high because there's only a few people making it and there's not a lot of competition, then what's going to happen is that consumers are going are going to be diverted into less useful or valuable products. And overall, eventually, you're going to get less national wealth as a result of it. So kind of hearkening on what Adam Smith was saying. So again, the idea here is that competition encourages multiple entrants into markets with initial high prices and products, and therefore people are profits, and the people are going to get into that market. But monopolies kind of curtail that competition. So the question for us is, how do monopolies affect the allocation of scarce resources with alternative uses? And what it does is that it forces the use of resources that should go into valuable products like apple juice to be diverted into less useful or valuable products. Okay. Now, what happens is that because the prices are so high, people aren't going to buy the apple juice. Now, the monopoly would prefer you to continue to purchase that product, but they're not going to. But even though you might have a reduction in demand of that product because the price is so high, people are still going to eventually, every once in a while, buy apple juice. And when they do, that higher price is going to capture those high profits. The result is that we're going to shift those resources into other areas that may be less valuable, and then therefore less national wealth. But as Sol points out, monopolies and cartels are very difficult to maintain in the long run. And he actually he goes into some detail on page 149 and 150 with examples of cartels. Now, a good example of a cartel is what's going on right now in oil, right, where you've got Russia and Saudi Arabia and other countries involved with this cartel called OPEC, oil and petroleum exporting countries. Well, that cartel had kind of busted up, and there's always incentives of individual nations to kind of cheat on the arrangement. And typically what happens when you're a cartel is you want to try to restrict supply and increase the price of your product. Now what's happening, of course, is that the United States is not a member of OPEC, and we have discovered large petroleum and oil deposits in shale, and they're now being fracked and being put into the open market. And what happened was that Russia first, and then Saudi Arabia stopped abiding by their cartel rules, and the result was a reduction of the price of oil at the same time that this COVID virus is reducing the demand for oil and petroleum because of people sheltering in place and not engaged in economic activity. So it was kind of a double whammy. But that's just an example of sometimes it's hard for a cartel to actually discourage individual members of a market from abiding by its dictates. So one example he uses is railroads in the 19th century. This is on page 150. It says, when railroads were formed in the 19th century, they often had competing lines between major cities like Chicago and New York. They called those trunk lines. And there was actually competition in the trunk lines between these two major cities, right? But then there would be called branch lines, which would go off of like a spur off of those major trunk lines, and oftentimes those did not have competition, and they would go to smaller little towns. And that what happened was that there was monopoly prices on the branch lines to compensate for the competition that was going on with the trunk lines. More importantly, from the railroad's point of view, the trunk line prices were so low as to jeopardize profits. In order to deal with this problem, the railroads got together to form a cartel, particularly for the branch lines. And there was a lot of reaction to this. The Grange movement, the farmer populist movement was a big response. And eventually you get government regulation in the form of the Interstate Commerce Commission in the late 19th century, and also the Federal Trade Commission and antitrust legislation overall. But what Sol points out is that these cartels kept breaking down. The cost of sending a train from here to there largely independent of how much freight it carries. Therefore, above break-even point, each additional ton of freight yields nearly pure profit. Sooner or later, the temptation to offer secret rebates to shippers to capture this profitable at any price traffic would become irresistible. So even though initially there were these cartels in railroad shipping, they ended up eventually breaking down. Steamboat companies did the same thing. He points out, and so it's very difficult to maintain these cartels over time. Now, the one example of a cartel that did maintain for a long, long time was steel. And he goes into some great detail. This is Andrew Carnegie and U.S. Steel, which was originally based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And it was a system that made it easy for companies within the cartel to check up on each other to determine if anybody was actually cheating. That was an example where even Sol, who's very skeptical of government intervention, would say that antitrust laws would be needed and the courts would be needed to enforce those, which they eventually did in a very, very large landmark case. So anyway, this kind of goes into, again, the monopolistic price means that less valuable products are going to be used, and less national wealth. But monopolies and cartels are hard to maintain. There are always incentives for individual members of a cartel to cheat, and there are examples in history: railroads, steamboats. Steel is the exception that proves the rule, and that did require government intervention. So then the last topic that he points out in this section on monopolies and trust is what to do about it in terms of what the government can do about it, but something that's underappreciated, according to Sol, is that private companies also have stepped up, and then sometimes there are different types of companies, maybe not producers but retailers, that have an incentive of not having high prices of goods, but actually having low price goods so that they can turn around and put a markup on them themselves. And so he goes into detail on both of those. It starts on page 151. Now, it was just kind of a nomenclature thing, a kind of a label that got tagged with some of these big companies that would be colluding together to fix and set the prices for products. So they were called trusts. So you had a sugar trust and a grain trust and a cattle trust, an oil trust, a steel trust. And so what ended up happening was that, particularly with Teddy Roosevelt and the beginning of the progressive movement, there were efforts to actually place limits on these trusts that later became known as antitrust laws. So they were really designed to outlaw monopolies and cartels. Now, the next chapter is going to go into some detail about why these antitrust laws sometimes have gone counter to what their original mission was. But leaving that to the side, he would say that those antitrust laws that's a government response to the problem of monopoly. And in the case of the steel industry, with that pretty sophisticated cartel system that Carnegie had established, Sol would argue that sometimes it is necessary for the government to come in to basically stop the collusion of price setting by particular firms or a few firms. But he says that, interestingly enough, there are also private responses to monopolies that work just as well and often better. So he uses the example of Montgomery Ward, which was at that time the largest retailer. It'd be like something like Macy's or something like that. And Montgomery Ward was one of the biggest opponents of trusts. Whether the trusts involved agriculture, bicycles, sugar, nails, twine, Montgomery Ward would seek out manufacturers that were not part of the trust and buy from them below the cartel price, reselling to the general public below the retail price of the goods produced by members of the cartel. So Montgomery Ward got pretty good at finding alternatives to these cartel products. And they got so big that they were actually able to start not just retailing the product or selling the products, but they actually, if they ran into a situation because they had a pretty high profit margin of still dealing with the cartel, sometimes they would actually get into the business of not just selling the product but manufacturing the product as well. And so they actually sometimes would set up their own factories to make certain products. Sears and Roebuck ended up doing the same kind of thing, and then A&P grocery chains did as well. So in the case of Sears, they not only sold products, but they would produce stoves, guns, shoes, wallpaper, among other things, in addition to subcontracting the production of other products. The A&P imported and roasted its own coffee, canned its own salmon, and baked billions of loaves of bread for a year for sale in its stores. And so here, it's basically competition that eventually, again, some, especially with a new product, think about computers, and we'll talk about Microsoft in the next chapter. Sometimes you do get a situation where a new product is made. I mean, think about Facebook or Google. These are new. But what he would say that over time, you're going to get other companies, even maybe not even in that particular market, but maybe in other subsidiary markets that are going to have an incentive not to go along with the cartel of the monopoly, because they don't want higher prices either. Not, and they're not consumers per se; they are businesses who are also serving consumers. Okay, and so he gives an example of India, where actually what ends up happening is that, again, there are a few naturally occurring monopolies in the world, but most of the monopolies are created by government itself. And we saw that with Adam Smith, didn't we? Where the East India Company was granted a monopoly for all sorts of things, and then Smith railed against it because it ended up creating shortages. It created um, less national wealth, and so he was obviously a big advocate of free trade and letting supply and demand basically set the prices of goods and services. Well, India, when it became independent, continued this policy of actually picking winners and losers in the market, and it had a huge impact on reducing the amount of national wealth that India could produce. And eventually, they ended up liberalizing or eliminating some of these monopolies that the government was granting, and the result was, lo and behold, as Adam Smith would predict, higher national wealth. Okay, so he says on page 152, in the absence of government prohibition against entry into particular industries, various clever schemes can be used privately to try to erect barriers to keep out competitors and protect monopoly profits. But other businesses have incentives to be just as clever at circumventing these barriers. So what happens sometimes is that the government might try to actually prevent a monopoly from occurring, but over time, those those laws will actually be used to shelter or protect one firm versus another, and that's really the topic for the next chapter. But he's kind of setting up the argument. So anyway, there's really two kind of major ways to deal with monopolies and cartels. One is through government antitrust laws that would basically fine monopolistic behavior of firms, cartels, and trusts. But then there's a private way of doing it, which is other companies fight back. In the case of retailers like Montgomery Ward, Sears, and A&P, they did, and they sought out non-monopoly suppliers and made their own products, and so that ended up busting up a lot of monopolies. The problem sometimes is when government itself becomes the sponsor of a monopoly, and that becomes when the government's supposed to be not allowing monopolies and they are actually creating it, that ends up becoming a major problem. For the United States, really the issue is we have a lot of these antitrust laws on the books, but they end up getting enforced in ways that are actually counterproductive to the original reason for their creation. So that will be the topic that we'll turn to for the next lecture on Monday. Okay, so for that's it. This I'll create a Google Forms assignment for this, which will be due, I think, on Wednesday. Okay, all right. Thank you very much.